it's fair to say you've made a fortune. If I made that money, I'd sit on a beach, I'd drink beer, and I would just watch the sunset. Kind of like a Corona beer commercial. Have you ever thought about that as a career option?
I find that really pretty boring. So that would be torture. If I had to do that every day, that would really be pretty awful for me.
Are you motivated beyond just profit motive and racking up dollars? And
no, I'm a volunteer. I mean, I don't need the money. There's nothing. It's not like I'm sitting here saying, I wish I could buy such and such a thing. I could buy it. I get paid minimum wage, actually. I don't even get overtime.
You got out of PayPal and Zip2, with a lot of money. Instead of buying mutual funds or, I don't know, doing what everyone does with several $100 million, you decided to start a rocket company with the express purpose of, making it cheaper to get stuff in outer space and then eventually going to Mars, or helping humanity go to Mars. And I just wanted to know, why.
Well, when I was in college, there were sort of three areas that I thought of what's really going to affect the future of humanity in a significant way. The three things that seemed to be most significant to me were the internet, the transition to a sustainable energy economy, and the third was the extension of life beyond Earth, becoming multiplanetary. I didn't think I'd be involved at all in option three, but the reason I think it's important is it goes to how we decide that anything is important. And the lens of history is a good way to distinguish what seems important in the moment from what is truly important over the long term. And if you zoom out and look at a long enough period of time, and say the 4 billion year history of Earth, and the evolution of life itself, then there's only about half a dozen or so major milestones in the history of life. There's obviously single-celled life, multicellular life, differentiation to plants and animals, the transition from oceans to land, mammals, consciousness, and then also on that scale would fit life becoming multiplanetary. It would be, I think, at least as important as life going from the oceans to land, probably more important or more significant, because at least that was a gradual transition. If things got a little uncomfortable on land, you could just hop back in the ocean. And that's not really feasible on interplanetary journeys. So, here we are. It's sort of the first time in the 4 billion year history of Earth that life has been able to go beyond Earth. And that window may be open for a long time, and I'm optimistic that I hope it will, and I'm actually fairly optimistic about the future of Earth. But something may happen that closes that window and prevents life from extending beyond Earth. And that risks the extension of life, or at least consciousness as we know it. And that would be a terrible thing.
So, essentially, I was trying to figure out why we had not made more progress since Apollo. In the 60s, we went from basically not being able to put anyone into space to putting people on the moon, and developing all the technology from scratch to do that. And yet, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we've kind of gone sideways. And that doesn't really gel with all of the other technology sectors out there. The computer that you could have bought in the early 70s, would have filled this room and had less computing power than your cell phone. And so just about every sector of technology has improved. Why has this not improved? So I started looking into that. Initially I thought, well, perhaps it's a question of funding, and that funding can be garnered by really marshalling public support. So I thought, well, one way to get the public excited about space would be to do maybe a privately funded robotic space mission to Mars. So we figured out a mission that would cost about $15 to $20 million, which isn't a lot of money, and the idea was called Mars Oasis, where we'd put a small robotic lander on the surface of Mars with seeds and dehydrated nutrient gel that would hydrate upon landing, and you'd have plants growing in Martian radiation and gravity conditions. And you'd also be maintaining essentially a life support system on the surface of Mars. And this would be interesting to the public because they tend to respond to precedents and superlatives. And this would be the furthest that life's ever traveled and the first life on Mars, so pretty significant. And then when I started looking at launch vehicles, the lowest cost vehicle in the US is Boeing's Delta II, which costs about $50 million. And that's a bit steep, what we were trying to do. So I made 3 visits to Moscow, to Russia, to look at buying a Russian launch. And it's actually pretty interesting going to Moscow to negotiate for a refurbished ICBM. But we actually did get to a deal, but there were so many complications associated with the deal that I wasn't comfortable with the risks associated with it. So when I got back from the 3rd trip, I thought, well, why is it the Russians can build these low-cost launch vehicles? Because it's not like we drive Russian cars, fly Russian planes, or have Russian kitchen appliances. I think the U.S. is a pretty competitive place, and we should be able to build a cost-efficient launch vehicle. So I put together a feasibility study which consisted of engineers that have been involved with all the major launch vehicle developments over the last 3 decades to figure out, well, what would be the smartest way to approach this problem of not just launch cost, but also launch reliability. And we came up with a default design.
Well, I think it's really a mindset. You have to decide we're going to try to do things differently. Well, provided that they're better. You shouldn't do things differently just because they're different. They need to be different and better. But I think you just have to sort of decide. Let's think beyond the normal stuff and have an environment where that sort of thinking is encouraged and rewarded. And where it's okay to fail as well. Because when you try new things, you try this idea, that idea, well, a large number of them are not going to work. And that has to be okay. If every time somebody comes up with an idea that has to be successful, you're not going to get people coming up with ideas. Well, it's like the Nike slogan, just do it. Just showing up is half the battle. You got to try hard to do it, and don't be afraid of failure. You also need to be rooted in reality. So you shouldn't. It's easy to get high in your own supply, as Scarface said. You got to not be afraid to innovate, but also don't delude yourself into thinking something's working when it's not, or you're going to get fixated on a bad solution.
What is your hope in terms of the impact you will leave on culture?
I think what I'd like to do is help solve some important problems. So I think in a small way, help build the internet, and then with respect to the global warming problem, the transition away from oil and other hydrocarbons to something which is clean and sustainable, I hope to have an impact there. And then with respect to space, the long-term ultimate objective, the holy grail, is to help make life multiplanetary. That's really what we'd like to do.